Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by sharedserviceslink and sponsored by Redwood. Today, we will be looking at how to realize the power of robotics in shared services. My name is Sarah Fury, and I am the head of research at sharedserviceslink, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Neil Kinson, who is the Chief of Staff at Redwood Software. You, of course, have an important role to play in today's webinar, and that is to make sure that you get your questions answered. Please use the chat functionality on the right-hand side of your to submit questions to us throughout the webinar. The earlier you submit the questions to us, the more likely we will be able to answer them in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So we'll be conducting a Q&A session. Just to touch briefly on the agenda for today, I will be sharing the results from a survey that we conducted with Redwood earlier this year. We'll then be exploring some ways that you can actually realize the power of robotics in your organization. Again, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So touching a little bit on the context for today and why we're here today, the automation, is no surprise, is something that's really been widely embraced by shared services for many years now. However, we are starting to see the landscape evolving, and we're now seeing robotics and robotic process automation, also referred to RPA, really on the rise at the moment. However, we're also anecdotally seeing an incomplete understanding of what robotics actually is, not always having a complete definition of it, and not knowing some of the functionality that robotics can do, such as interface with your ERP system. That's why earlier this year, sharedserviceslink and Redwood conducted a survey with our audience, with over 100 finance and shared services professionals, to better understand about how shared services are using robotics. Just to give you a sense of scale of the size of our audience, about 75% of our audience are $1 billion+ companies, and 60% of the respondents to the survey were from Fortune 2000 companies. So now, before we go into a little bit about what robots look like in action, we wanted to launch a poll to better understand who is on the webinar with us today. So coming up on your screen should be our poll question. We are asking, what is your experience using robotics at your company? Is this something that you're maybe just in an exploratory research stage? Is this something that you're actively looking at? Are you using robotics in other departments, but not necessarily yours? Are you using it in your department? Or is robotics something you're using at an enterprise-wide level? If you've not been on a sharedserviceslink webinar before, we do share the results live, so we do like to get lots of you voting. I see we have about 68% of you voting, which is great. So I will be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and that's with 75% of you participating. So here are the results coming up on your screen. And interesting to see that actually 50% of you are just in an exploratory research stage. 25% are actively looking at robotics. 9% of you are using them in other departments, but not your own. 14% are using robotics in your department. And only 2% are using them at an enterprise-wide level. So that'll be interesting to compare now to how it looked with our survey respondents. So coming up on your screen here are how it came up in our survey. So it's very similar, actually, that about 75% of you were still in a research stage, and it's actually 73% in total that were in a research stage in our respondents. That's looking at those two robots on the left. 38% in an exploratory research stage, and 35% were actively looking at using robotics. And that's, again, a smaller percentage that are currently using them. It's only 27% using robotics currently, and just 8% using it in their department. However, from those two robots on the left, we do see that there is significant growth on the horizon. More specifically, we can see that when we asked respondents how they are planning on driving further automation in the next 12 months, RPA came up as the number 2 answer. Behind ERP capability, you'll see here that 72% of respondents said they plan on using a current ERP or investing more into their current ERP capability. But over 2/3, to 67%, plan on using robotic automation to drive automation in the next 12 months. Just looking at how that compares to some of the other tools, 38% using in-house tools, 36% cloud computing, 32% SaaS automation tools, and only 6% not planning any further automation. So what do we really mean by robotics? And what is this robotics that's on the rise in shared services? We want to spend some time actually understanding what we mean by robotics, and we want to understand how our market understands robotics. We actually went out and asked our respondents in a free text question, what does robotics mean to you? And interesting to see here that the responses vary quite wildly. We shared some of the responses that came out here in the bubbles on the left. But it's some sort of automation tool. Maybe it's some kind of human-free processing, or automation with artificial intelligence. And while we felt some of the responses really hit the nail on the head, there was a dramatic understanding of what robotics actually is. In the word cloud here on the right, we pulled out the words that came up most often: cognitive, workflow, processes, automated. So these words are probably the ones that are chiming with you and your understanding of robotics. However, when we dug into the functionality of robotics, the understanding variations really started to stand out here. We asked our respondents, what do you expect robots can do for your organization? And in this bar chart here, you'll see a few different lines. The green line represents people that said, I think robots can do this. The red line means that people said, I don't think robots can do this. And the blue line indicated that they weren't sure. So 2 things really I want to pull out here. Is that the ones to pull out at the top 3 are the ones that people really understand, okay, this is when I know robots can do this. And that's automated data entry tasks, to automate processes so that they can operate for the most part without human intervention. That's 83%. And to document and maintain an audit trail. However, it's worth looking at the bottom half, or the bottom 2 in particular, where about 50% or fewer think that robots can do this. So only 52% think that robots can understand basic finance processes, and just over half, 51%, believe that robots can replace human activity, and that it can be performed by robots end to end. Neil, I want to bring you in on this point and what you make of this chart and our findings here.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks, and hello, everyone. I think from my perspective, it's quite striking from the data that we see here that, that there is very clear acceptance on the first 3 points that the role of robotics can eliminate some of the very, very simple, mundane, repetitive activities. But as we move more into tasks that are considered higher value and more complex, then the level of confidence and the level of understanding about what can be achieved is somewhat more challenged. And I think it's really no great surprise, because I think a lot of people have seen robotics as a generic tool that can be deployed against those kind of mundane activities, whereas one of the things we see emerging in the marketplace, and of course we see as core to the approach that we take, is very much about embedding those processes and delivering robots that already have an awareness of that end-to-end process and the manual accounting tasks. So there's a theme that comes very much about how much time and energy do you need to capture those processes, and if you're building that all from yourself, then I understand that concern. So it's a theme we'll come back to as we move further through the session.
Thank you, Neil. And that brings us into our next point here, and that the variations in understanding really does impact what respondents believe can be achieved with automation. Again, pulling up that stat from the previous chart, that 97% of respondents recognize that robots can automate manual entry tasks. yet only half think they can achieve some of the more advanced finance processes and understand the advanced finance processes. And again, only half thinking that they can replace human activity on an end-to-end scale. We don't have the chart showing in this presentation, but we also asked people just to open up their minds a little bit and think, if you had all the resources that you needed, could you potentially automate procure to pay, order to cash, record to report at different levels? And less than half of respondents actually thought it was possible to automate more than 60% of record to report, order to cash, and procure to pay process in their organization, even if they had all of the right resources. So really what we take away here is that robots do actually have a wide range of capabilities and have changed dramatically over the years, but the general understanding of the capabilities varies. So we also want to understand what are people's potential objections or fears about robots and robotics. And this chart here, we asked people that very question, whether they had any objectives or reservations about using robotics. And really the number one thing that came up here was that people weren't sure about the return on investment. And perhaps tied into that was that people thought they didn't necessarily have the technical expertise to implement them. Going down the line a little bit, you'll see some people are concerned about RPA leading to job losses in general, 30% thinking they could be hacked, and 24% believe it may take a long time to set up. Fortunately, 18% said they had no concerns, 16% said they may lose control of the process, and a very small percentage thought that they might lose their own job because of robotics, and only 3% said that they don't trust them. So Neil, I want to bring you in on this point again, please.
Yeah, no, and I think that it's very interesting that, and I see the first three points there as being very much linked, in the sense that, the demonstrable return on investment, I think, is a reflection of the maturity of this marketplace. It's still a relatively new and emerging space. So, I think as an industry, we need to do a better job of articulating, where we truly have delivered that kind of return on investment. And that leads very much into, the nervousness and concern over what is the IT aspect of these programs. I think, rightly or wrongly, the perception is that an IT-heavy approach to driving this process change is something that takes a long time, and that has, unfortunately, a very, very high risk of failure. Just one other kind of observation, really, on that, and it's interesting, that it comes through, and this is something that I think we've seen a lot of in the press, is this personification of the robot, creates some, quite interesting concerns. 30% of the people consider that the robots could be hacked. Well, I think if you look at the security attack vectors in most organizations, actually, robots tend not to write their passwords on a Post-it note and stick it in their drawer on their desk. And actually, that's often the major issue in those social engineering challenges. So it's something we have to be careful of when we use that approach of personifying the robots too much. It's great at helping demonstrate what a return on investment is, but sometimes it kind of overstates the danger of the thinking machine.
That's great. Thanks so much, Neil. And I think now that we've covered the fears of robotics, it's important now to understand what are the benefits that our respondents are seeing from robotics. And what you'll see on this slide here is actually some really quite impressive stats. So this is focusing in on the respondents who actually have used robotics in their organization. And we asked them what benefits they have seen. And these numbers are actually really quite impressive. 84% reported improved process efficiency, 75% seen improved accuracy of data, 75% again improved productivity of FTEs. And even going down the charts, these numbers are still quite big. 69% reduced cost, reduced auditability, reduced scalability, both at 66%. 63% have reduced risk, and 53% reported improved visibility of processes. So here we see that the majority of respondents have seen significant benefits from robotics, and the number one benefit being improved process efficiency. So this, again, was just for respondents who have used robotics. We also asked people, both who are using robotics and who aren't using robotics, which do they think would be most valuable from robots. And interesting here that people thought the number one thing would be that robots could manually automate manual data entry tasks. However, this is spread out a fair bit in the top four. 21% reported that the most valuable thing would be replacing human activity through an end-to-end process. 19% reported that they think it'd be most valuable to automate processes so they can operate for the most part without intervention. And then going down the list a little bit more, automate robots that can understand basic finance processes. 11% documenting on an audit trail, perform accounting tasks without having to code them themselves. And only 3% reported it'd be valuable to robots that can interact with approvers and supervisors. So really, again, focusing on here that the top few, that 77% there up at the top believe the most valuable function of robotics would be to automate data entry, replace human activity throughout the end-to-end process, and automate processes that, for the most part, could take place without human intervention. Neil, what's your take on this chart here?
So I think it's interesting, particularly when you kind of you use the insight gained from the previous one as well, that we see a clear pattern from those people who have seen benefits from robotics around quite a broad-based set of benefits and values, not just simply the elimination of effort and people on there. There are things around quality and the accuracy of data, etc. So there's a much broader scope there. But when you look at the focus here about the automation of data entry tasks, I think what's striking is you get down into the elements that perhaps have a lower response. There's actually a little bit of a contradiction there, because if we're really going to drive significant productivity and replacing a certain amount of human effort through the end-to-end process, then absolutely we need to effectively interact with approvers and supervisors. What I see here is actually freeing people up from the drudgery of the manual activity in the preparation and collection of information needed to support a decision, and freeing people up to apply their thought and judgment to what that data and information is telling them, rather than chasing the effort of producing it. And so to me, I'm quite surprised that 3% of people think there's value in driving that interaction, because to me that's key to unlocking a lot of productivity that we can get out of that end-to-end process.
Thanks, Neil. I think that's a really interesting point there about freeing people up and unlocking their productivity. And I think we really see that come out in the next point here. Again, we asked our respondents an open text question, and to really think, if manual tasks were a thing of the past, what would be different about your organization? So again, this is a free text question, so respondents could answer however they liked. And we've pulled out some of the respondents' responses down here. The people thought that they could have more time to focus on value-added activities, which would have a direct impact on their customers' experience. People said they could have a smaller team, increase salaries, provide higher value. As you mentioned, that you could use their skilled staff for more higher-level activities and insightful activities. People thought they could have more, better equipped to do more cost analysis, and that in general, they'd be more effective and lean. So of the 100 respondents, we took all of those and tagged them to which categories they fell into. And 44% of responses said that they believe they would have more time for value-adding activities if manual tasks were a thing of the past. 33% said that they would enjoy improved efficiency. 12% identified that they actually provide a better quality service. And 5% indicated that they thought it would improve their corporate culture. Other respondents outside those percentages commented on improved controls, better data, and improved visibility. Neil, how do you find this responding in the market and some of your customers? Are they feeling any of these things? Do they get any of these responses when they're able to implement robotics?
No, I absolutely. I think we kind of concur with many of these findings. I think to amplify that, though, one of the things we see as quite a recurring theme, actually, is something that doesn't really come out here, which is what about job satisfaction and employee satisfaction? I mean, it's touched on 5% improving the corporate culture, but to me, it's broader than that. And I think, particularly as we've got a new generation entering the workforce who perhaps have different expectations and different experiences, and feel that they're here to deliver a grander purpose than simply collecting their paycheck. And the fact that you spent years developing and honing your skills to then spend all of your working day really doing monotonous, repetitive activities versus actually helping your business grow, I think is something we see quite regularly within our customers. And it's not just for altruistic reasons. It's good, sound common sense, because a lot of these organizations have quite a significant attrition issue, and also significant challenges around talent acquisition. So to me, I think that's a really, really important theme, and we really shouldn't underestimate the value of that to organizations.
Thanks, Neil. I think that's an important point there. So I know we've thrown lots of data and lots of information at you throughout this presentation. So I just want to take a moment to summarize some of our responses before we go into some of our conclusions. So just to wrap up some of the data findings, we identified that robotics is not yet widespread, but it is growing. Again, only 27% of our respondents use it currently, but 67% were planning on using robotic automation within the next year. Also, we found that our respondents' understanding of robotics varied quite significantly, particularly when it came to some of the more advanced capabilities of robotics. So the third takeaway here is that about half our respondents didn't actually believe it was possible to automate a high percentage of their finance processes. But at the same time, you'll remember that when they do think they could eliminate this, there's real value in being able to free up the capacity and focus on higher value skills. In addition, we identified that the interest in robotics in general is high, but the main concern and the uncertainty was about the return on investment, and having the technical expertise to implement RPA were the biggest concerns for those looking to implement automation. So with all this in mind, we've developed three tips to help you actually realize the power of robotics in your organization. And really just to drum in some of the reason for doing this is that we see robotics really changing traditional business models, and it's altering economies of scale that really have traditionally been driven by outsourcing. Robotics will disrupt shared services to an extent, so we really do believe it is important to find ways to help realize this power in your organization. So the first tip we have is that it's important to take a process-centric approach rather than a user-centric approach to robotics. Now, as we've seen from the survey, many see robotics as a way just to replace manual tasks, just maybe replacing some manual data entry. However, there may be much more value in looking at how to apply robotics to the process as a whole, instead of just replacing piecemeal parts of the process. Neil, I'd like to bring you in on this point to expand a little bit further.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of high-level message there as well, which by looking at individual tasks within the process and making them better, the focus is on basically doing the job better rather than doing a better job, which you can achieve by looking at the end-to-end process. And I think that's something that we see, which is unless you've got to focus on the outcome and how you can more efficiently deliver that outcome for an individual process, whether it's a high-level finance business process or a discrete sub-process that forms part of that, it's almost impossible to just improve it from every single granular task up. What you effectively do is accelerate the execution. There's a famous quote from Henry Ford that talks about if I ask my customers what they wanted, I would have sold them a faster horse. And to a certain extent, applying robotics at that task level does just that. It delivers the faster horse. Whereas, our view is it's really essential that you say, what is the prize? What are we actually moving towards? And how, given the ability to remove this mundane activity, how can I best use those resources I have to get towards that outcome?
That's great. Thanks, Neil. I'm going to take this onto our second point now, which our second tip is that to work robotics into your current ERP or applications. As you'll remember, the majority of our respondents, 72%, were planning on using their ERP to drive further automation in the next year, which isn't surprising, as the ERP really is the backbone of most enterprises and shared services and their master system of record. So organizations are right to start here on their automation journey, but to remember that robotics can integrate with your ERP and log into your system of record and actually log into systems like SAP or Oracle to deliver a more comprehensive and transparent audit trail and really improve your functionality quite dramatically. Neil, how do you see this point applying in reality?
I think, if you look at the last 20 odd years when people have invested very heavily in standardized ERP applications, one of the reasons we did that was to deal with a standardized approach, was to take, rather than everything being bespoke and built, for one particular need, we built out standardized business applications. And, the notion was the process was, good enough in order to meet my business requirements without having to build everything bespoke. And what's happened over time is we've surrounded that standardized business application by a whole variety of technologies that augment the execution of the business process, where that standardized business application perhaps doesn't provide the most productive way of driving that. And in some ways that was born out of necessity, because there wasn't a different way to achieve the same thing. But imagine if you could actually orchestrate and control your system of record in a coherent way through the end-to-end process without those productivity barriers. If you could do that, then absolutely your preference would be to do all of it within the system of record, rather than building islands and silos that exist outside of your system of record that support the business process. And that's very much the approach that that we take. And we also look at some of the other tools that are out there that look at integrating through the user interface as the point of integration. Well, if you've got a 1980s built banking line of business application, then the user interface is probably the best and only approach to integrate that. But if you've invested in a standardized business application, typically from two of our major partners, SAP and Oracle, the reason you did that is because of the standard business interfaces and applications that come with it. It would seem, to me, illogical to then integrate with those applications using the paradigm of the user interface, when those published digital machine-to-machine interfaces exist, are stable, and will continue into the future. And that's very much the way that we look to orchestrate those processes.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to explore the third tip that we have to help you realize the power of robotics in your organization. And that is to take the multiple factors into your business case. And we hope on the webinar today, you've picked up quite a lot of these other factors outside of just FTE release. So as we found that the major reservation about using robotics was the return on investment, and it also as well as the technical expertise to implement robotics. However, if you look at some of the benefits that people have seen, it's important in your business case to actually build in a lot of these other benefits, such as the reduction of risk, reappropriating the high-value skill and innovation to develop some value-adding activities for your skilled employees. Reports on the respondents seeing improved accuracy, reduced errors, improvements in quality, visibility, process automation, and it may be difficult to quantify, but as well as job satisfaction and improvements to corporate culture are real benefits that organizations are seeing, in addition to scalability and flexibility they provide. Neil, how do you see this playing out and people building their business case for robotics?
Well, I touched earlier on, one of the things that we see as really important, which is, how do we improve the job satisfaction of the people that exist and continue within, those shared services functions. And I really wouldn't underestimate the importance of that. A number of our customers have really been driven by that, partly because they want to improve their satisfaction, and partly because typically with some of these processes they're putting so much stress on the machine that it's becoming potentially a risk and a point of failure. From the stress increases risk and errors, but also it drives that attrition risk because people are spending they're spending their late evenings and weekends doing things that they realize they shouldn't really need to have to do. And we also use this term capacity release, and that can sound sometimes sound like a euphemism, but what we really mean by that is people are looking at how can they deliver more value from the resources they have today. They're not always looking to reduce those resources, but how can they deal with the extra workload associated with an acquisition? How can they deal with the extra workload associated with the growth of their business? How can they focus more of their resources as a business onto growing their activities rather than actually running the activities? And those are all just as important as just looking at this can eliminate 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever as a percentage of the FTEs that operate within that. I'd be wrong to claim that that wasn't a driver for a number of organizations, but it's certainly not something that should be considered the primary. I think there's another couple of angles here as well, which is if you can imagine your process would look like if you had an inexhaustible supply of resource. What controls would you bake into the execution of your processes? What additional documentation would you include to satisfy your auditors and to demonstrate, either if you're an outsourced shared service center, that you're complying with your contract or you're driving process excellence? In many cases, there are lots and lots of things that would be extremely useful, and by extremely useful, that also correlates and translates into things like reduced audit cost. It drives into reduced challenges and interactions with your auditors. So it just improves the efficiencies of that overall audit process. So the potential benefits are extremely broad as you drive that through. So it's really, really important not just to be too focused on that one dimension.
Thank you so much, Neil. So I'd just like to take a moment. If anyone has any questions, please do submit them using the question functionality. We have covered a lot of ground here, but before we move on to questions, I want to hand over to Neil again, who can provide a little bit more information about who Redwood is and actually how they help organizations, like yours, actually apply robotics within their organization. So over to you, Neil.
Hi, so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Redwood, but we're a provider of automation solutions that have been operating in the market for over 23 years. We were born and brought up in the enterprise application world and in the world of ERP. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've really started to focus on not just delivering world-class technology, and there's a lot of concerns raised through the survey here about organizations' ability to deliver these large-scale technology projects. And our approach to that was, well, yes, it's a given through our heritage. We have this world-class technology, but what we need to bring to bear to support that is essentially the process knowledge and know-how that really plays back to that point I made earlier about understanding the outcome and what you're trying to achieve, not just the technicalities of how you can eliminate individual tasks and activities. And that's something that we bring to bear with our approach to robotics, which is very much driving the efficiency of the end-to-end process rather than just simply looking at how we can augment and accelerate individual tasks that are executed by individual end users today. That's built really on a platform of understanding and knowledge and experience of dealing with the primary applications that operate within the ERP world and all of the associated tools like data warehouses, reporting, BI, etc. All the things that form part of that landscape, is something that we really focus on. And what does that drive and deliver? Well, what we believe is the level of automation that can be achieved with this end-to-end process approach is in the range of 70 to 100%. In some cases, yes, we believe we can eliminate 100% of the manual activity within those business processes. If it's rule-based, and if those business rules can be defined, and if those data sources can be accessed, then ultimately there's no reason why we can eliminate 100% of the activities within that process. Of course, that's an extreme example. But I think that compares and contrasts quite well against some of the relatively small and organic productivity improvements that can be delivered by simply removing and eliminating, at the task level, individual and discrete tasks that may form part of the process. And that's really, without taking too much of the time, because I don't want to turn this hugely into a pitch about Redwood, but that's very much the kind of philosophy behind our approach to robotics and how we see ourselves as, as differentiated from some of the other technologies and tools that are garnering a lot of focus as this is becoming a topic, as demonstrated in the survey data here, that's on the front of mind with people in this community.
Thanks so much, Neil. So some great information there, and I'd like to now move on to some questions. So yes, the first question, very much for you, Neil, is a listener asking, how important is it to have technical expertise to implement robotics?
It is important, I think, because clearly there has to be some kind of interaction with your existing technology and estate. But if I were to look at our most successful implementations, they have been run entirely by the business functions and the global process owners calling in relatively limited requirements from their internal or external IT function. So yes, these things run on infrastructure within the organization. So, we need to provision servers and hardware to actually deploy, technology within the organization. And yes, there are some technical requirements around, making sure we have the necessary ability to communicate with those systems. But beyond that, this is not about re-engineering or modifying or changing anything that happens within those ERP systems. It's merely exercising and exploiting the standard and published interfaces that are already there, that people are already using day in, day out. And that's very much why it has a relatively low and certainly manageable IT impact. I'm not going to claim it's zero, because that wouldn't be credible.
That's great. Thank you. And another listener asking, if you could maybe give some examples of a typical process that's been enhanced by robotics and what it actually took to implement. So, yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of, of simple activities. So, there's an awful lot of those data entry type examples that you talk about and would see on a regular basis. But taking that up a step in terms of at a higher level business process, one of our key customers is one of the world's largest software companies. They actually apply this technology. Actually, they're also an ERP provider, but I can't really go into too much detail as to who they are. And what they do is they manage one of the key critical business processes within finance in a large software company is revenue recognition. In this case, it was touching hundreds of people. It was a very manual process, and it was something that they were only able to run once during the close. By providing that through a robotic solution and applying the rules, because the rules that define recognition of revenue were very well defined and understood, they're described very much as part of the applicable accounting standards, they were able to complete and run that revenue recognition process. Instead of once per close, they were able to do that multiple times. Not only did they free up a significant number of people from those manual activities associated with the running of that revenue recognition process, what they're also able to do was actually run the process multiple times, free up more revenue,
and demonstrate, by 100% compliance with the rules, but actually effectively, deliver a direct return and improvement on the business results by being able to recognize revenue that otherwise the bureaucratic manual process would have failed to release. So that's a good example at the kind of high level of how you can take a process level view rather than just a task and activity level view.
That's interesting, Neil, and it kind of ties into this next question. So you touched on this a little bit, but I think this kind of is a bit more forward thinking as well. And that we've talked a lot here about process-centric approach rather than a user-centric approach when thinking about robotics implementation. But the listener's asking, when we look at the end-to-end process in a way that's taking a user-centric approach, how far can they go to neglect the users if they're moving towards a as-a-service model?
Sorry, Sarah, can you just repeat? You broke up a little bit in the middle of that one, yeah?
Yeah, sure. So again, looking at kind of the process-centric approach as opposed to the user-centric approach, when you look at the end-to-end process in a way that's taking a user-centric approach, how far can you almost neglect the users if you're actually looking at moving towards an as-a-service model or a process-centric model?
I think it's dangerous to neglect the users. Because ultimately they have the knowledge and understanding of what actually is done versus what perhaps a process documentation actually claims to be done. So certainly you need to have an understanding of that. What you don't necessarily need to do is to model every single mouse click, keystroke, and activity at that kind of level. What you need to capture is when they prepare information, where do they get it from? What are the steps that are required? And what do they do with it when they get it? And what business rules do they apply to that once they have it? And I think those are the things that you capture as you move towards that as a service model, rather than you move the mouse to this button or this click point and you click there, etc. So I leave that to the audience to say, is that an end user or is that a process owner, or what is the role within the organization of the people that have that kind of knowledge? But that's very much the approach that we take. And in terms of building and demonstrating the business case, what we also do and capture as part of our engagement process here is, we look at the time and activity that people spend doing these things, as well as the activities themselves. Because one of the reasons there's a lot of cynicism about the demonstrable ROI is, as an industry and arguably as a customer base, we're very, very focused on benefits realization at the outset of a project and program and making sure we buy for the best price. What we're not always very strong at is making sure at the end of that 3-year program we've actually delivered what we set out to deliver. So that's one of the things we focus on as part of the engagement, is making sure that we can demonstrate where that activity has been eliminated and how, now that the robot is doing it, how much time and energy was spent doing that previously. What the customer does with that, whether that's an as-service model or whether it's an in-house resource, that's not something we necessarily, that's part of their business strategy that drives how they deal with that. But that's very much the approach that we take.
Thanks so much, Neil. Another question from our listeners on compliance and control. How can robotics enhance compliance and control within the transactional process? Do robotic solutions also include a suite of exception reporting to highlight areas where manual intervention may be necessary?
So this kind of plays on one of the earlier survey answers, which I think was a relatively low response based on how does this interact with supervisors and process owners. And that's really a key point, because the split that we would typically see, it's not too far from the classic Pareto split of 80-20. That is, 80% of the effort in the execution of these business processes is associated with the preparation and manipulation of data, and 20% of the activity relates actually to the use of judgment, thought, and skill in terms of the interpretation of those results. And as you look at that, and as the process interacts with those people, here's something that's a little different with the approach. What we would do is where someone is required to apply that judgment, where someone is required to review a particular report or a particular piece of information, we will present that information to that user with a series of choices, so that within the context of their favorite collaboration tool, doesn't have to be email but could be, they have the access to all of the pre-prepared reports and data that they need in order to make that decision. That decision is routed to the appropriate individual by the managed execution of the associated business rule. So if a particular tolerance on an approval falls outside the defined limits within a business process, then it will be routed automatically to the appropriate person defined in the controls who has the authority to actually execute against that particular task and activity. So partly this comes from orchestrating and describing the process and the business rules from a robotized process, rather than enforcing some kind of intelligence or big brother type approach with that. As well as that, the decisions that are made, and I made that point earlier, we can capture a very, very granular set of information. So much as we presented those reports, that data and information that they needed to make that business decision where judgment was applied, we actually save and capture that information. So not only can I capture, the particular approval or otherwise that was made by an individual, I can also capture the precise information that was made available at the time that they made that decision. And from that, suddenly all of the level of control and the level of information that is available to your internal controls function, to your auditor, etc., way exceeds anything that's possible than what is essentially today trust that says, my control framework said that this user needed to log onto this system, check that this balance was within this limit, and then log on to my control system and confirm that I've completed that check. What we can actually do is say this person reviewed that information in this attached PDF or spreadsheet at this time based on these thresholds, and this was the decision that they made. So it's a really granular level of information that is possible because of the inexhaustible supply of labor, if you like, through the activity of the robot.
That's great. Thanks so much, Neil. Great answer. Another question for one of our listeners is, what kind of approach do you see your clients using, or do you perhaps recommend using? Would it be kind of a wave approach to implementing robotics, or having some kind of hard cut over when going live with an automated robotic process? And what difference do you believe those two different approaches may have?
So I think the era of the Big Bang is, I think, is behind us in this space, because too many of those Big Bangs have actually turned out to be big explosions rather than the significant change that they were expected. So we very much, and really playing on that lack of confidence that some people have about what is the art of the possible. It's really, really important that you take the organization forward with you on that journey to demonstrate that. So we tend not to be too aggressive by suggesting that people need to, wholesale adopt the highest levels of automation. I've talked in some cases up to 100%. We certainly wouldn't recommend that they start there. So give me an example of our customers that have worked on record to report. Typical evolution of that is, they will actually run the automated process in parallel with their existing manual record to report processes and compare the results. They might do that for one or two close periods, and then flip over to actually believing and accepting that the results from the robotic execution of the process are as accurate, if not more accurate, than what was delivered through the manual process. And one of the great beauties of this kind of approach is it frees up capacity to allow you to drive and apply your standard quality tools to then continue to drive organic process improvement. Because what a lot of people talk about is, do I need to come in and have the perfect process before I start to robotize and automate? And we would say, no, that's not the appropriate approach. Why? Because far too many of those perfect process documentations are gathering dust on a ring binder in someone's folder somewhere, And also, it really plays to that point I talked about earlier, which is what appeared to be the perfect process when you were constrained by the paradigm of manual activity may well not be the perfect process when you're not dependent on that manual activity. So, things that were a problem historically that were driven out by data entry issues may no longer be a problem in the automated world and may be eliminated. So rather than spending time and effort trying to engineer that out, the reality is those problems may no longer exist, and you can focus on, where have I got a resource issue? How can I augment my resources? How can I implement additional controls? How can I implement process improvements and drive continuous improvement? And that's very much the kind of approach that we would see. Because what you're doing is eliminating activity and reducing the amount of manual activity. You're not changing overall the way the process is executed. The fundamentals are the same. You're just effectively removing the hands from the keyboards.
Thanks so much. And it's an interesting point you made there about building the internal trust of robotics, so your internal teams need to trust them. One of our listeners is asking, how much do audit firms trust robotics on finance and administrative processes?
It's interesting. If you'd asked me that 2 years ago, I would say there was a huge degree of cynicism and concern about whether that was viable. One of the interesting things is now if you look at the organizations that we're talking with, both from an advisory and from an audit capacity, some of them actually see the adoption of this kind of technology as complementing their approach to audit, because they can deliver efficiencies by delivering a completely new audit paradigm, which is based on a audited, automated process that produces, as a glorious byproduct of its execution, a fantastically granular audit trail. And rather than having auditors basically spend lots and lots of time, again, on non-value activity, simply trying to find supporting documentation and printouts of information, they get through every execution of the process, a in-context, set of audit data. So we're really starting to see them embrace that. Now, note of caution there is, of course, that's very, very challenging as to how do they then implement and deliver that, because of all the challenges around that audit business model going on right now. But one of the interesting side effects of the regulation that forces the regular audit change is suddenly the desire to produce a differentiated audit offering is something that is really, really important in the marketplace. So that's something that we are seeing. So I really don't see them as being a barrier to that kind of approach.
Thanks, Neil. Another question for our listeners is asking if can Redwood integrate robotics with any business software? Are there any kind of limitations there, or which ones do you work best with?
So our focus and experience is certainly within the the primary business applications you'd see out of there, whether that's in the Oracle and the SAP suites. We've been long-standing partners of both organizations, but there's a broader ecosystem there because we've been at this for over 23 years. There is no such thing as a end-to-end process or an ERP implementation that is done exclusively and entirely within one or two of those providers. It is by necessity a hybrid world. That's a hybrid world where organizations have a combination of tools from those two providers, as well as for example, in the current climate, a number of best-of-breed cloud-based applications, whether that's plugging the gap for CRM or other aspects of the tool set. So we have very rich experience of doing that. If you were to say to me, can we integrate with some of the more exotic tools that are out there and that perhaps have a smaller use space, then technically it's possible, but of course the amount of effort versus the reward might be significant. So certainly our focus is on the large industrial strength and industrial grade ERP tools that are out there and their associated infrastructure and ecosystem.
That's great. Thanks so much, Neil. Another question here about the understanding of finance processes and robots understanding finance processes. Would you be able to expand a little bit on what you mean by that, perhaps in some specific finance sub-processes like order to cash or record to report? And what exactly robots may know about finance processes or come trained as finance experts in some way?
Yeah, so I'm certainly not that finance expert, so I'm not going to, in this context, kind of claim to be anything other than that. But let me explain the approach and difference around that, and then we can actually, get into the details. So, what's the traditional IT and technology approach to supporting a business process? It is to say, I have this wonderful and fantastic shiny technology tool. That's why there's a reticence that comes earlier in the survey associated with that. What would you like to do with it? And it's down to you as an end user to be able to articulate and express that business process in such a way that we can capture that. What we have is a team of people who've worked in this shared services center world, and we've got a set of capabilities that we reuse and redeploy within the implementations, because one person's approach to asset depreciation is going to be 80% consistent with the next. And of course, there will always be other examples of very specific approaches in industries that are different. But broadly, the core finance processes are consistent. There are different challenging points. If you're a volume versus a value business, then you may have different pain points, but ultimately those fundamental processes are very, very similar. So this is not something that talks about cognitive or AI and all of the hype that is wrapped around that. It's quite simply, we already have documented and built the process maps and the interactions and the approval steps and a large proportion of the business rules that are necessary to orchestrate the processes, whether that's in finance and increasingly within supply chain and HR. It's not that it's some kind of magical disclosure and discovery of those processes. It's just we're taking that starting point much further towards the process outcome than we could. And partly we're doing that through technology, but more importantly, we're doing that through a series of resources and expertise that we can deliver with the approach that have that expertise. They're experienced accountants, they're experienced people who've worked and built and implemented shared service centers. And that's basically how we achieve that.
That's great. Thank you. So yeah, we're nearing the hour, but I think let's maybe squeeze one or two more questions in. How long does a typical project implementation typically take? I appreciate this will vary quite a bit, but do you have any examples that you could give?
So I think one of the examples that we had, we went from now this customer, to be fair, had a very, very good handle on their process documentation, and one of the big challenges we get on some of these projects is how comprehensive is the documentation of what actually happens within the process. So I will caveat it at that point. So it's at the extreme low end of that. But from that customer that had an exceptionally high quality of process documentation, it was 3 months before they were executing their first record to report process using the robotized processes, and that was globally across the organization. Sure,
that's pretty sharp. So again, I think probably the final question now. If you're interested in robotics, what would you say some of the best approach advice on how to actually start with a pilot for robotics?
Sorry, can you repeat that one there?
Absolutely. If you were interested in robotics, what would you say would be some best approach, best advice on how to start with a pilot for a robotics program? How do you get the ball rolling?
Yeah, how do you get the ball rolling? And it's probably not going to surprise you by I'm saying it's starting with looking at some of your processes. Because if I'm preaching a process level approach with that, the first thing to do is to understand where your biggest process bottlenecks and biggest value can exist. So what we work with are those process experts to actually identify the areas that we would focus on. So rather than focusing on researching the market, identifying there is a particular tool for, I don't know, balance sheet reconciliation and saying, I'm going to choose one of those, what we would do is say, let's come in and look at the basket of processes that you execute, and let's look to see where we can deliver, essentially the quick wins that build that confidence and demonstrate value, and more importantly, deliver that ROI in the short term. And that's very much the approach that we would take with that. So it's got nothing to do with technology. It's starting from that process perspective first. Of course, there's some due diligence we'll do from the technology. We'll need to know which ERP systems you have and things like that. But it's very much a process level conversation, not a technology and tool level conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Neil. And as we're approaching the hour, I would just like to say thank you again for a really great session and for fielding those questions. And thank you very much to our listeners today for a very lively Q&A session. Just like to wrap up, we have lots of other content coming up on our webinars on Shared Services Link on a variety of topics that will be appropriate for you or your colleagues, and a number of conferences coming up both in Europe or North America. So we do hope to see you on one of them soon. And thank you very much for your time and attention today, and goodbye.